That's a pretty hard job, I can guarantee you. And not only hard, but it's hot too. It's good to call the attention, but it can be a huge distraction while I'm bringing the word, all right? So my name is Hilton. I'm a partner here at Crosspoint, and it's a privilege for me to share the gospel message this morning. And we're going to continue with the Hebrew series. I know you're probably wondering, what am I going to do with this? But I can guarantee you, we have a lot to think about when you think about our Christmas season of our days and the way the Bible describes the real Christmas. So we just sang a song that is very popular. We just sang a song that is very known as one of the most famous Christmas carols, right? Why didn't we have the lyrics on the screen? You don't need it, right? We all know it by heart. We sing with our children. We listen it in the radio. We all know what that song is about. However, when we look at the holiday season nowadays, and we're going to look at this song a little bit, we can see and notice how far away from the real Christmas and for the so-called Christian traditions we have gone during this time of the year. Follow with me some of the words of the song that we just sang. All right? So it starts saying, you better, what? You better, you better, and then gives you a reason. What's the reason? Is he? And then it gets worse, okay? He sees when you're sleeping. He knows. He knows. Anybody has been good around here? But then it says that he's coming to reward the one that is naughty or the nice. Did you realize how this song makes Santa Claus so much to appear to the popular image of God? Have you ever thought on those categories? That song makes Santa Claus very similar to and I will emphasize, the popular idea of God. Nothing to do with the real God. Because the popular idea of God is someone that is watching out for everything we do and making sure you do it right, because if you don't, he's going to get you. Isn't that the popular idea of God? That's how we have this feeling of right and wrong. That's why we have this feeling that we need to prove something. Well, in the song also this, that he is coming to reward those that deserve. Well, this is not even true in terms of the song itself. In my lifetime, I have yet to know a person that did not get a Christmas present, despite the niceness or the naughtiness. The only ones that I met that did not get something is because hard was so life on the family on those days that they didn't have any means to buy anything. Not because they were good or bad. We sing this, we have our children singing that with us about, Santa Claus, about being naughty and nice. We even say, be good for goodness sake. My goodness. Seriously? But that's how we sing. That's how we look at things. But despite of anything, everybody gets something on Christmas, right? The real thing is, there are places where Christmas is not even a real thing. Our youngest daughter right now is on a mission trip, and she just arrived in the desert of Uyuni in Bolivia. And from the pictures she sent us and from we were talking about the other day, There's no sign of Christmas there. They probably don't even know what it is. So she and her team, they were trying to bring something of Christmas, doing some things and making color papers, trying to bring the idea of Christmas. For us, this is out of the question because we are so used to it. We're so spoiled to that idea that we don't realize how important it is, and sometimes we get so used to it. But what I want is to shift the focus of our mind from the cultural aspect of the season and talk about the one that really came to town, Jesus. He came. He is the one that came down from heaven. And the interesting and most exciting part about the coming of Jesus, which is real, is that he came exactly because neither of you or I are nice enough. Am I right or am I right? Jesus came because we are all so naughty that we could never, ever measure up. That's why he came. He didn't came trying to find someone that he could do something. No, he came because he knew no one deserved. He came because he knew no one could measure up. And that's what Advent means, coming. On the church calendar, this is the time of the year that we call the Advent time. And in other places, in certain other Christian traditions, they have a celebration for every Sunday approaching to the Christmas Sunday. Because that's something very important, that someone that came to make a totally difference. And Jesus came because we are all naughty. Therefore, the only thing that he could give us was his own life. And did he do it? Yes, he did. Not on Christmas Day, but he did it on the cross. And if we are here today as Christians, a little over 2,000 years after that, it's because one day, Jesus came to town, looked at all the naughty ones, and said, I'm dying for you, so you can come out clean and live the life that you were supposed to live. And looking at the book of Hebrews this morning, I would like for us to understand and to see how important this is, because this is the central message of the book of Hebrews, that Jesus gave the life once and for all. There is nothing else that needs to be done. And to remember this, I want to go to something that Chen did last week, which was he went on a tour of the tabernacle. I'm not going to go over to it again. He went over to every detail, what each part meant and what was the importance of this. But I want to focus on the idea of what the tabernacle as a whole meant and how important it was. Because the tabernacle and later the temple, what they meant at that time, it was a concrete and visible reality of the presence of God. The tabernacle and later the temple, they were important not only because of what they represent, but because they were the concrete scene and understanding for those people of the presence of God. But it was also the clearest and most concrete representation of God's grace. And let me tell you why. In all the details of the temple, there was what they called the outer courts, which was this outside part before the sacrifice. Why is the outer court so important? It's because the outer courts are the part of the temple, or the physical part of the temple, that was separated for those that were the outsiders. So both the tabernacle and the temple were the only house of worship on the ancient Near East that had a room, physical room, for those who did not belong. And guess where you would stay if you lived on those days? On that place. Because this was done for the Jewish people of that time. And if you did not belong to that particular ethnicity, you were outsider as far as the temple was concerned. But God was so gracious that this is the only representation on the ancient Near East that had a room for the outsiders. Do you remember that passage when Jesus came into the temple and got so upset that he started throwing things around and putting tables down? We, with our capitalistic mind, have the tendency to think that what really bothered Jesus is because they were selling stuff. I can guarantee you he wasn't happy with that. Because what they were selling there, it was things that were needed to do the sacrifice. And they were making money out of that. He wasn't happy with that. But what made him really, really, really upset is because they were doing that on the outer courts, on the place for the outsiders. So the insiders did it in such a way that the outsiders could not come anymore. So Jesus, who came to town to make sure everybody would have the opportunity to have their sins washed away in his blood. And that's a beautiful biblical imagery, because blood is red, but we are washed in it and come out clean. How? That's God's problem, not mine. What I know is that when you put your faith in Jesus, something totally new comes in you. And you start understanding and enjoying life in the presence with God. That's our place. In the tabernacle would be the outside area, physical outside area, but we would be inside the tabernacle area. We wouldn't be inside where the special people could go, but there would be a place for me and you. Where's the place for the Christmas message these days that we are living? How much the advent, how much the coming, the real coming, have on us? With that in mind, I like to go back to Hebrews chapter 9. And we'll read from verse 15 to verse 22. When we're going to talk about a covenant. There are two images that they use in this text. The covenant in the beginning, and then talks about the being in the presence of God on the second part. We're going to talk about the covenant first. Verse 15 of Hebrews 9. Therefore, he, Jesus, is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeemed them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. For where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established, for a will takes effect only at death, since it's not in a force as long as the one who made it is alive. Therefore, nor even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of the calves and goats with water and scarlet, wool and hyssop, and he sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant that God commanded for you." And in the same way, he sprinkled with the blood both the tent, the tabernacle, and all the vessels used in worship. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. That is one of the probably weirdest images that we can imagine nowadays. That to have any kind of forgiveness, there is needed some blood. So let's think a little bit of the covenant idea, which he mentions right in the beginning of our text, that Jesus is the mediator of the new covenant. But to know what the new covenant means, we need to understand what the old covenant was, because that's what the Hebrew readers of this letter had in mind. They didn't have in mind what we think of a covenant or a contract or whatever word we want to use. They had something totally different than what we think today. Because back then, in the ancient Near East, every covenant, regardless of what covenant it was, it had to be done through blood. And here's what they did. They usually would get some animals, cut the animals in between, in the middle, put each half on the sides. And what happened between these halves after you cut the animals? What do you think there was in the middle of them? A lot of blood. That's right. A lot of blood. And how was the covenant settled? The people that were getting the covenant together, that were going under that covenant, had to walk through that blood. I know you're feeling yuck. I would too. But that's how they did. But more important of what they physically did, more important than what they physically did, is what it meant. It meant that if you break the covenant, it's going to happen to you exactly the same thing that it happened to the animals. So back in the days, when a covenant was set, and you did not follow what the covenant said, what happened to you? The same thing that happens to the animals. Did you get the picture? Maybe this will help us understand what the Bible tells us in Genesis chapter 15. And if you have the opportunity, you can open there. Because in Genesis 15, we have a description of the covenant that God made with Abraham. And it's very interesting, the description, because it says on Genesis 15 that God requested from Abraham to bring, verse 9, he said to him, "Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon." And he brought him all these, and cut them in half, and laid them over the side. So God, in the Old Testament, came to Abraham's terms. And this is very important to understand the correlation. We just sang a popular Christmas carol. That is not necessarily true. And I'm making the relation that the one that came to town was Jesus, by God's grace, to save us from our naughtiness. All right? But here we are, way back in the Old Testament, when God is establishing a covenant with a man forever. And what does God do? Couldn't he just said, "Abraham, you just do this. This is what I'm telling you to do. I'm God. You either follow or..." No. God came down. God came down on Abraham's terms. He asked Abraham to do something that he really understood what he was doing. He had no confusion in his mind what he was dealing. Getting into a covenant with God. So he brings the animals exactly as asked. He puts them apart exactly as asked. And then he's waiting for the time that he has to walk in the between. But God doesn't show up. God doesn't say anything. The birds start coming, trying to eat the food, and then Abraham starts putting them apart. And then by the time he finishes with the birds, the night is coming and he is getting really, really, really tired. And what happened with Abram? He falls asleep. When Abram falls asleep, who walks between the bodies? Who walks between the blood? On verse 17, it tells us, when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. Would Abram ever be able to fulfill the covenant? Would he have a chance to fulfill that covenant? So what did God do? He was so gracious that he waited until Abram could not walk through it. And he did. So the old covenant was made in the name of God. And the only way to establish a new covenant, what does the covenant finish? When blood is done. What God do? He sent Jesus. And Jesus' blood introduces us to the new covenant. So the reason now the Hebrews can associate, the ones that are reading this, with everything that is new is because they know what Abraham have gone through. They know that he wasn't able to walk through it, just God did. So God had to be placed so we could have the covenant. And where do we find God's blood? In Jesus. And to keep us our mind and to give us an idea of how important it is, verse 17 of Hebrews 9 give us a very good analogy that I think will help us understand how important it is, this idea of death and the blood and everything. It says, for a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. So the old covenant was made through the blood, and God had gone through. So the new covenant established that new blood needed to be done, and Jesus did it. So to help our mind, let's think on a will. I think we all know what a will is, right? A will doesn't go into effect until somebody dies. And this is so important in our culture today that even when you go to the doctor makes that question to you. And let me tell you the truth. The other day, I had to go to the doctor. I work for a company that, every year you have to go to a checkup, okay? It's good that they made me do it because, I'm not those kind of fond of going to the doctor too many times. Especially because at my age, if you go to the doctor, it's just like take an old car to the mechanic. They'll find something, right? So I avoid as much as I can. But anyways, I went to the doctor. I had to, right? And there I am. And after he does everything he has to do, he asked me, do you have a living will? I looked at him and said, I must be really bad. That was the first thing that came to my mind. You're a doctor, you're not a lawyer. What about a will? Are you crazy? No. This is so important in our times that even the doctor tells you, you need to have something that in place. But when is the will? Why we take so long to do a will? Why would they take so long to put those things in paper? Because we don't think. Well, I'm alive. It's not going to happen anything until I'm dead. Yes, then when you're dead, it's too late to do the will, right? But that's the idea behind it, and that's what the text is telling us. A will is only good after death comes. It's the same thing with the new covenant. Jesus had to die. Jesus had to do everything so we could enter in the presence of God and have a good relationship with Him, which we'll see in a moment. But the covenant made by God's blood is a new covenant and a lasting covenant, because since Abraham didn't walk through, we also did not have to die, because Abraham didn't walk through. Who walks through was God. Who had to die to establish the new covenant? God. How does God die? In Jesus. And his blood is the one who establishes it. Are you still with me? Did you understand the relation of the two covenants? So let me give one other explanation. Back in Abraham's time, when that sin happened, Abraham was looking to the future, and by faith, he had to believe that the Messiah would come. Is that correct? Nowadays, we are here in the future. What do? We look to the past. And by faith, we believe that the Messiah came. It was always by faith, never different. In the past, he looked ahead and said, this points to the Messiah. The tabernacle points to the Messiah. The temple pointed to the Messiah. Every single ritual pointed to the Messiah. Time has passed. And we look back, and by faith, we believe that Messiah has come, has died to fulfill God's blood in the covenant, and has cleansed us in such a way that we can enter into the presence of God. What does Christmas mean? That Jesus came to town. Not because he's looking for those who are nice. He's really looking for those who understand how naughty they are, and they need a Savior. I want to invite all of us to remember that in our Christmas celebrations. Because if we depend on our culture, on our times, and on our ads, and unfortunately, on most of our Christmas carols, that won't help us. We need to go back to Jesus and understand and let it fill us even more so we can celebrate the coming, the advent, everything that he conquered for us. But what does it mean to be in the presence of God? All this covenant was made so we could enter in the presence of God. In the Old Testament, that the Hebrews, the readers of the letter had, it meant the tabernacle or the temple. What does it mean nowadays? Verse 23 to verse 28. And it says, thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than this. So what he's saying in verse 23 is that the things that represented what was in heaven, which is the tabernacle and the temple, all of them needed to be purified. Remember that we read that Moses had to sprinkle everything with blood to purify them. They needed to be purified because they were just a representation. But what is in heaven needed a better sacrifice. Which sacrifice is this? Verse 24. For Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copy of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it in order himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the holy places every year with blood not of his own. For then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once and for all at the end of ages to put away sin and sacrifice of himself. And just as he appointed for men to die once, and after that comes judgment. So Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who eagerly waiting for him. What is this presence of God that the sacrifice provides? The high priest in the old would have to go into the tabernacle every year, only one day, and offer the sacrifice. And for us, is kind of weird because we don't have this kind of habits. But we understand what happened to Jesus. Jesus, no. He went one time. And he did not go either to the tabernacle or the temple. Jesus went into the real place in heaven to represent us and to get things in place. Why is this necessary? This is always necessary because when something is wrong, when there is wrongdoing, there is always a need of a settlement. Isn't that true? When something goes wrong, we need to settle it. We need to fix it. We need to find a way to get things straight. So how was the old covenant coming into the new covenant? How would the old way come to the new way? How are we now so far away from what happened to Jesus and to Abraham to be able to live a life that goes and takes us in the presence of God? It's because Jesus, when he did his sacrifice, he went once and for all in God's presence in our place. And then when God looks to us, he looks to a very special lens called Jesus. The lens through which God looks to us is Jesus. Because he is the one that went into his presence so we could go right behind him. Now let's us understand what that means, because the imagery that is used here is sometimes not very clear for us. But let's think on the idea of wrongdoings that have to be settled. And I believe that the world of sports these days is a good example of this. So next year, 2018, we have the Winter Olympics again, right? Who is out of the Olympics? Why? So it is being proven that they have been cheating repeatedly, at least according to those that judge that, right? And because of that, what happened to them? They are kicked out of the next one. There is a wrongdoing. It has to be settled one way or the other, right? That's the way they found. I'm not making any judgment on what they did. That's the reality. But the world of sports shows us another thing. Have you guys heard about a gentleman called LeVar Ball? Why laughing? Of pride or embarrassment? Okay. Maybe you're not familiar or you are so discomforted now that you don't want to think about it, but I'll make you to. All right? Because that gentleman has a son that was caught shoplifting. And what's the biggest surprise? The biggest surprise is that he is really complaining that the son is being held accountable for doing this. Am I right or am I right again? Are you serious? Oh, he's just a kid. In your house, not in the world. He's able to drive. He's able to go to another country. He plays basketball. He even had a contract ready. He's just a kid. Seriously? Is that how you raise your children? I hope not. Double standards in the same world of sports. And people are looking and asking, and the boys are looking for places to be accepted. And he's complaining because he was put on the bench. Double standards. We cannot really trust the systems we live in. But there is one system we can trust. And that is God's system. He established a covenant. And he said that if we come under this covenant, we can enter into his presence. And since he walked through Abraham's covenant blood, in order to establish the new one, so we didn't have to stay in the outer courts, but could go into the inner court, he gave his own blood. Let me picture that for you so you can understand how profound this is and how important this was for the Hebrew readers of this letter. These sacrifices that happen once a year, that Jesus did once and for all, it was so important that in Zechariah 3, we have a description of what happens in heaven after the sacrifice was done. So in Zechariah 3, the prophet describes to the people in his time what happens in heaven when the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies. And then he says like this, verse 3. Now Joshua was standing before the angel, clothed with filthy garments. And the angel said to those who were standing before him, remove the filthy garments from him. And to him he said, behold, I have taken your iniquity away from you, and I will clothe you with pure vestments. And I said, let them put a clean turban on his head. So they put a clean turban on his head and clothed it with garments, and the angel of the Lord was standing by. The high priest was in the Holy of Holies, representing the people. And then what happens in heaven? He was still not clean enough. The angel of the Lord. Who is the angel of the Lord? Jesus. Had to intervene. But this picture, it still doesn't get us. Let me tell you what happened before the high priest went into the Holy of Holies in Zechariah time. By the time of Zechariah, they were so afraid that that ritual had to be done right that the high priest took a 7 public baths before he went in there. And this is what happened. He would come on a stage like I am. The other priests would hold a cloth. And other priests would wash him to make sure he wouldn't even get dirty on anything. 7 times in front of the people. After that, they would clothe him with the pure clothes of the high priest so he could go into the Holy of Holies. After all that, he goes into there to offer the sacrifice. And then Zechariah says that when they looked into heaven to him, he was still in filthy clothes. What a desperate situation for them. But the angel of the Lord, even in the old covenant, gave him new clothes. Because on our own, there is no chance that we can meet the standards. You know why? Because regardless of what we want to say about ourselves, we are anything but nice. We are really naughty. But God came exactly because of that. Hallelujah. We are not stuck. We don't have to be good for goodness sake. We try to be good because we are so joyous of what God has done for us that I have to share it. I have to do it. I have to go. It's the other way around. I don't have to fake it. I have to enjoy it. I don't get to pretend. I get to live it in the presence of God because Jesus has paid the price. Jesus, the ultimate high priest. And we can see this again on verse 28. Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time. Not to deal with sin. Our hope didn't finish when we gave our lives to Jesus. He is coming. And he is coming. Right? He came. We all know. In faith, we all believe it. So live. Because he can come again. Even before this Christmas. If you ask me, I would be really happy. But I have 2 grandchildren in Brazil waiting for tons of presents that are already bought. So I want to be there. Right? I'm not different than anybody. I'm not blaming anybody. I'm just like everybody else. I have to force my mind to remember who is Jesus and what is Christmas about. Who came? Jesus came and died for us so we can live and express our lives in the presence of God. So our challenge is to remember that we don't deserve. It's not because we deserve, not because we are good, not because we do anything. The only thing we do is for God's grace and mercy. Not even for his sake, because he doesn't need us. He invites us. And I want to invite all of us to look at both the covenant that brings us in the presence of God as this coming, this advent of Jesus that changed our life forever, so can give us a new perspective. Merry Christmas in the new covenant through the blood of Jesus. Amen. Let's stand and pray.